The storm rolled over Oak Ridge like God's fury, black clouds swallowing the autumn sunset as rain hammered against metal and glass. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the old repair shop at the edge of town for brief electric moments before thunder shook the walls. Matthew Colton moved with purpose through the dimly lit garage, checking windows and organizing supplies. This wasn't his first storm, and it certainly wouldn't be his last. Rain drummed steadily on the corrugated roof as Matthew finished securing the last window. His weathered hands bore the marks of a lifetime of labor. Calloused palms, a small burn scar on his right thumb from a welding accident 3 years ago, nails perpetually rimmed with engine grease despite his religious scrubbing. At 42, his face carried lines that spoke of both laughter and grief, though the latter had carved deeper channels since Sarah's passing. The dog tags hanging from his neck clinked softly against his chest as he moved. The silver tags bore his name, blood type, and service number, but it was the words engraved on the back of the first tag that defined him: honor before fear. Lily sat cross-legged on the worn leather couch pushed against the back wall of the garage, her sketch pad balanced on her knees, colored pencils scattered beside her. At 10 years old, she possessed a quiet intensity that sometimes unnerved the other children at Oak Ridge Elementary. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, her mother's eyes, deep brown with flecks of gold, focused intently on her drawing. Despite the storm raging outside, her small hand moved steadily across the paper, adding shades of blue and purple to the night sky she was creating. Matthew glanced at the old battery-powered radio on his workbench. The weatherman's voice crackled through static warning of the worst storm to hit Oregon in 15 years. Flash flood warnings, possible mudslides in the hills down power lines already reported across 3 counties. The power had flickered twice already. It wouldn't be long before Oak Ridge went dark. Outside the garage, the small town of Oak Ridge battled the elements. Most businesses had closed early, windows boarded up against the wind. The supermarket had been stripped of bottled water and canned goods by noon. Main Street was deserted now, except for the occasional emergency vehicle lights flashing against rain-slick asphalt. Sheriff Miller had been on the radio earlier, urging residents to shelter in place, stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary. Matthew checked the generator he kept for emergencies, frowning as it sputtered and died after a few seconds. The damn thing had worked fine during his test run last week. He knelt beside it, examining the fuel line with an experienced eye. A partial blockage, possibly from the old gasoline he'd been using. He should have replaced it. Now, with the storm already upon them and the power threatening to quit at any moment, they'd have to make do with flashlights and battery lanterns. Something in his expression must have betrayed his concern, because Lily looked up from her drawing. The light caught the small freckles scattered across her nose. Another gift from her mother. Dad, what's wrong with the generator? Nothing I can't fix. Might take some time, though. He didn't mention that without parts, a proper fix was impossible tonight. No sense worrying her. They had enough supplies to get through a few days without power. Canned food, bottled water, first aid kit. The shop itself was solid, built in the 1950s with materials meant to last. The living quarters in the back were small but comfortable enough. A kitchenette, bathroom, 2 bedrooms. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Will Sheriff Miller come check on us like last time? He's probably busy helping other folks. We'll be fine on our own. Matthew moved to the workbench, rummaging through a drawer for tools that might help with the generator. His fingers closed around a wrench as memories surfaced unbidden. Another storm, another place huddled with his unit in an abandoned building as mortars rained down around them. Afghanistan, 2006. His sergeant's voice cutting through the chaos. Focus on what you can control, Marine. The rest is just noise. The skills he'd learned as a Marine had served him well over the years, especially after Sarah died. Focus on the essentials. Adapt and overcome. One day at a time. Simple philosophies that kept him moving forward when grief threatened to pull him under. For Lily's sake, he couldn't afford to sink. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the garage doors, pulling Matthew back to the present. Across the room, Lily jumped at the sound, her pencil skittering across the page. She quickly tried to erase the errant line, her shoulders tense. Matthew abandoned the generator and moved to the couch, settling beside his daughter. The leather creaked beneath his weight. He gently placed his hand over hers, stilling the frantic movement of the eraser. Storms pass, sweetheart. They always do. She nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the windows where rain lashed against glass with increasing intensity. I know. I just don't like the thunder. Matthew understood. It wasn't really the thunder that bothered her. It was what the storm represented. Chaos, unpredictability, loss of control. The same forces that had taken her mother transforming their world overnight from one of certainty to one where nothing could be taken for granted. He was about to suggest they make hot chocolate on the camping stove when he heard it. A sound distinct from the storm's fury. The low, powerful rumble of motorcycle engines, multiple bikes approaching through the rain. He stood moving toward the front windows. Through the curtain of water streaming down the glass, he could make out headlights cutting through the darkness, drawing closer. Lily joined him at the window, her small hand slipping into his. Who would be out in this? Matthew didn't answer immediately. As the headlights drew closer, he could make out the silhouettes of motorcycles. 15, maybe more. Their riders hunched against the driving rain. They slowed as they approached the garage, eventually stopping in the gravel lot outside. Through the storm's haze, he could see the riders were women. Tall, leather-clad figures dismounting from Harley-Davidsons, their movements efficient despite the weather. One of the riders, taller than the others with a confident stance that marked her as the leader, removed her helmet. Her dark hair was cropped short, practical. Even from this distance, Matthew could see the intensity in her eyes as she surveyed the area, gaze eventually settling on the garage. Something about her posture, the way she carried herself, struck a chord of recognition in him. "Dad, who are they?" Before Matthew could answer, his cell phone buzzed. Sheriff Miller's name flashed on the screen. Matthew answered, keeping his eyes on the women outside. "Matt, you seeing what I'm seeing?" Miller's voice was tense, urgent. "Got calls from 3 people already. Steel Roses MC just rolled into town." Matthew had heard of the Steel Roses, most people in Oregon had. An all-female motorcycle club with chapters across the Northwest, rumored to have connections to everything from illegal arms dealing to drug trafficking. The mainstream media painted them as dangerous criminals. Underground forums celebrated them as badass rebels. The truth Matthew suspected lay somewhere in between. "They're outside my place now, Tom. Lock your doors. Don't engage. I'm sending deputies your way." A rap at the garage's side door interrupted Miller's warning. Matthew moved towards it, cautiously peering through the small window. The leader stood outside, rain plastering her shirt to her shoulders. Behind her, the other women were securing their bikes against the wind, covering what equipment they could. "They're just looking for shelter from the storm, Tom. Those women aren't what they seem, Matt. The Steel Roses have been involved in 3 shootings across state lines. ATF's been tracking them for months." Another knock, more insistent this time. The woman outside was scanning the perimeter, her expression growing concerned as the storm intensified. Lightning revealed her features more clearly. Strong jawline, a small scar bisecting her left eyebrow, and eyes that had seen combat. Matthew was certain of it. "I'll be careful, but I'm not leaving women out in this storm." He ended the call before Miller could protest further. Lily stood frozen by the workbench, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "It's okay, Lily. They're just people who need help." The uncertainty in her eyes didn't fade, but she nodded slowly, trusting his judgment as she always did. Matthew moved to the door, unlocked it, and pulled it open. Wind and rain immediately assaulted him, soaking his shirt in seconds. The woman stood her ground despite the elements, eyes assessing him quickly before she spoke. "Need a place to wait out the storm. Trees are coming down on the highway. Not safe to continue." Her voice was deeper than he expected, with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to giving orders. Up close, Matthew could see that she was probably in her late 30s, with the lean muscle of someone who lived an active life. What caught his attention, however, was the chain around her neck partially visible beneath her collar, the distinctive shape of military dog tags. Behind her, the other women had gathered a sea of leather jackets with the Steel Roses emblem emblazoned on the back, a metallic rose wrapped in thorny chains. They watched him warily, rain streaming down their faces. Some looked exhausted, all were soaked to the skin. Before Matthew could respond, shouts erupted from across the street. Several of Oak Ridge's residents had emerged onto their porches despite the storm, pointing and yelling. "Don't let them in, Colton. They're criminals." Someone call the sheriff. The leader of the Steel Roses didn't flinch, though something hardened in her eyes. "We're not looking for trouble. Just shelter till the storm breaks." Matthew hesitated for only a moment. His instincts as a Marine, as a father, as a man who had seen how quickly life could turn, all aligned in that instant. He stepped aside, opening the door wider. Come in. Relief flashed across the woman's face, quickly masked by a nod of acknowledgement. She turned, gesturing to her companions. As the women began moving toward the door, more shouts came from across the street. Matthew recognized Robert Coleman's voice among them, surprised by the venom in his tone. These women had clearly stirred something in the normally affable store owner. The steel roses filed into the garage, bringing with them the scent of rain leather and motorcycle exhaust. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of a unit accustomed to working together, taking up positions around the perimeter of the space respectful of the tools and equipment. None ventured toward the living quarters in the back. None approached Lily, who watched from beside the workbench with wide eyes. The last woman through the door was older than the others, perhaps mid-50s, with silver streaking her auburn hair. She nodded to Matthew as she passed. Not everyone would have opened their door. Thank you. Matthew secured the door against the howling wind. When he turned, the leader had stepped forward, water dripping from her jacket onto the concrete floor. Alexandra Reeves. Most people call me Alex. She didn't offer her hand, maintaining a respectful distance. Her gaze flickered to his dog tags visible where his rain-soaked shirt clung to his chest, then back to his face with new interest. Matthew Colton, this is my daughter Lily. Lily raised her hand in a small wave, still uncertain. Alex's expression softened almost imperceptibly as she acknowledged the child. Sorry to intrude on your evening. Storm caught us by surprise. Forecast said it wouldn't hit till tomorrow. A particularly violent thunderclap shook the building, causing several of the women to glance toward the ceiling. Outside, the shouts had faded as Oak Ridge's concerned citizens retreated from the worsening weather, but not before Matthew caught fragments of their conversation. Calling Miller, warning others watching his place. Matthew gestured toward the back of the garage. There's a camping stove if anyone wants coffee. Bathrooms through there. Not much space, but you're welcome to what I have. Alex nodded, then turned to address her companions. Jesse, check the bikes. Make sure everything's secured. Gabe, first aid if anyone needs it. Rest of you, minimal footprint. We're guests here. The women dispersed, their movements betraying varying levels of exhaustion. Matthew noticed that several bore the subtle signs of military service. The way they scanned exits, positioned themselves with clear sight lines, maintained situational awareness even in repose. These weren't just motorcyclists caught in a storm. These were veterans. A young woman with a prominent scar across her jaw approached Lily cautiously, keeping a respectful distance. Cool drawings. You an artist? Lily nodded, some of her apprehension fading. She held up her sketch pad, revealing the night sky she'd been working on before the storm intensified. The young woman, Jessie, Matthew presumed, examined it with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. That's serious talent. The way you captured the light through the clouds, not easy to do. Pride bloomed on Lily's face, chasing away the last of her fear. A small connection, but significant. Matthew felt some of his own tension ease as he watched his daughter begin to explain her technique to the interested biker. Alex had moved to the window, peering out at the storm. She turned when Matthew approached, her expression guarded, but not hostile. Your neighbors aren't thrilled about our presence. Can't control what other people think. Something like respect flickered in her eyes. No, but it affects you all the same. We can move on once the worst passes. Matthew glanced out the window. The rain had become a solid sheet of water, tree branches, whipping violently in the wind. Not in this, you can't. Highway 58's probably flooded in sections already. Alex didn't argue the point. She seemed to be studying him, trying to place something. Marine Corps. Matthew nodded, not entirely surprised she'd recognize the signs. Most civilians didn't pick up on the subtle markers that distinguish different branches of service. 2 tours, Afghanistan. U3 tours, Afghanistan and Iraq. Force recon. The information shifted something in Matthew's understanding of the woman before him. Force reconnaissance was the Marine Corps Special Operations Unit. Elite, highly trained. Not a path many women had taken, especially during the early years of those conflicts. He wondered what else he didn't know about Alexandra Reeves and her steel roses. A commotion outside drew their attention back to the window. Sheriff Miller's patrol car had pulled up, lights flashing against the darkness. Behind it, 2 more vehicles. Deputy Carson's SUV and Mayor Bennett's Lincoln. Not a good sign. Bennett had been vocal about cleaning up Oak Ridge since his election last year, focusing particularly on undesirable elements passing through. A motorcycle club with the Steel Roses reputation would certainly qualify in his book. Alex's posture shifted subtly, a soldier preparing for confrontation. Your sheriff works fast. Miller's a good man. But the mayor has something to prove. I'm familiar with the type. The side door rattled with an authoritative knock. Matthew moved to answer it, conscious of the tension that had filled the room. The steel roses hadn't changed positions, but there was a new alertness in their postures, hands slightly more visible, stances wider. Preparing without appearing threatening. Another military tactic. Sheriff Miller stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat. His face was grim, eyes flicking past Matthew to take in the garage's occupants. Mayor Bennett loomed behind him, attempting to see past Miller's shoulder despite the rain soaking his expensive suit. Behind them both, Deputy Carson maintained a watchful position beside the vehicle's, hand resting near his holster. "Matthew, we need to talk." Miller's tone was professional but tense. Matthew stepped outside, pulling the door nearly closed behind him. Rain immediately drenched him again, but he maintained his ground, creating a barrier between the officials and his garage. Mayor Bennett wasted no time. "Those women are members of a known criminal organization, Colton. Harboring them could constitute aiding and abetting." Matthew had never cared for Bennett, a former real estate developer who'd moved to Oak Ridge 5 years ago, with grand plans to revitalize the small town. His vision of progress involved pricing out longtime residents and bringing in boutique businesses that catered to weekend tourists from Portland. Their travelers caught in a storm seeking shelter. "Nothing more, Sama." Bennett scoffed, rainwater spraying from his lips. "The Steel Roses aren't some innocent cycling club. They've been connected to illegal weapons, drug trafficking, extortion allegations, not convictions." Miller's interjection surprised Matthew. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, caught between duty and fairness. "But the mayor's right about one thing, Matt. These women bring trouble. 3 businesses were shot up in Eugene last month after a dispute with the Roses." Matthew stood his ground, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "So arrest them if you have cause. Otherwise, they're my guests until the storm passes." Bennett stepped forward, using his height advantage to loom over Matthew. "This isn't just about you, Colton. It's about the safety of this town. What happens when their enemies follow them here? What happens when your daughter gets caught in the crossfire?" The mention of Lily sent a flash of cold anger through Matthew. He straightened, matching Bennett's stance. "My daughter is my concern, and right now she's watching how we treat people in need." Miller placed a restraining hand on Bennett's arm, sensing the escalating tension. "We're not making arrests tonight. But Matthew, this needs to be temporary. Once the storm breaks, they need to move on." Before Matthew could respond, the garage door opened wider. Alex stood there, her expression controlled, but alert. "Problem, gentlemen." Bennett's face contorted with barely concealed disgust. "We know who you are, Ms. Reeves. Your reputation precedes you." Alex didn't rise to the bait. Her gaze remained steady, moving between the 3 men with calculated assessment. "We're passing through. Storm forced us to stop. We'll be gone once it's safe to ride." Miller studied her with professional interest. "Eugene PD has some questions about a shooting last month. 3 injured. Witnesses placed Steel Roses at the scene. Witnesses also placed us defending ourselves against the Midnight Skulls who attacked one of my women first." Alex's tone remained even, but Steele underlined her words. "Check your reports, Sheriff. Charges were dropped." Miller nodded slightly, acknowledging the point. Bennett, however, wasn't satisfied. He pointed a finger at Alex, rain dripping from his manicured nail. "I'm watching you. One step out of line and I'll have every one of you in cells before you can start those overpriced bikes." Alex's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. The mayor of Oak Ridge making threats in a storm. Interesting governance strategy. Bennett's face flushed with anger. He turned to Miller. "I want officers stationed here all night. We don't have the manpower. Storm's got officers responding to downed trees, power lines, flooded roads. Then I'll organize concerned citizens to keep watch." Miller's patience visibly thinned. "You will do no such thing. Last thing we need is vigilante nonsense during an emergency." He turned to Matthew. "I'll have a cruiser drive by when possible. But Matt, this is on you. Any trouble?" "There won't be any trouble." Matthew's tone was final. "They're sheltering from a storm, nothing more. We'll all get through the night just fine." Miller held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. He turned to leave, physically steering Bennett back toward their vehicles. The mayor's protests faded into the storm as they retreated. Matthew closed the door, turning to find Alex still standing there. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, revealing a complexity of emotions she quickly masked. "Your sheriff seems reasonable." "Mayor's an ass." Matthew couldn't disagree with that assessment. Bennett had run on a platform of traditional values that resonated with some of Oak Ridge's older residents, but his implementation had revealed a narrower agenda than many had anticipated. Most people here are good folks, just cautious around strangers. Alex's mouth curved in a humorless smile, especially leather-wearing motorcycle-riding female strangers with questionable reputations. She moved back into the garage where the atmosphere had subtly shifted. The women had arranged themselves more comfortably, some sitting on the floor with backs against walls, others standing in small groups conversing quietly. One, the silver-haired woman who'd thanked him earlier, had produced a deck of cards and was dealing a hand to three others. None had ventured into his living quarters or disturbed his belongings. They had made themselves at home while respecting boundaries, another military trait. Lily had overcome her shyness and was showing her sketchbook to Jesse and another woman with a sleeve of intricate tattoos. The young biker was explaining something about perspective, using her hands to frame an invisible scene, while Lily nodded with rapt attention. Alex followed his gaze. Jesse studied art before enlisting, full scholarship to RISD, gave it up after 9/11. The casual revelation added another layer to Matthew's understanding of these women. Not just bikers, not just veterans, but individuals with complex lives and abandoned dreams. He thought of his own interrupted path, the engineering degree he'd never completed after his third deployment, the plans he and Sarah had made for a different kind of life. The older woman with silver, streaked hair approached, offering Matthew a steaming mug. "Hope you don't mind. Found your coffee. Seemed like you could use some." Matthew accepted the mug gratefully, realizing how cold he'd become in his rain-soaked clothes. "Thanks." Gabriella. Most call me Gabe, former Navy corpsman, another military connection. Matthew was beginning to see a pattern. Most of you served. Gabe's expression grew more serious. All of us. Different branches, different wars, same struggles, coming home. The simple statement carried the weight of shared experience. The difficulty of transitioning to civilian life, the challenges of finding purpose after service, the struggle to be understood by those who hadn't seen what they had seen. Matthew had faced those same challenges, complicated by Sarah's illness and death, by the sudden responsibility of raising Lily alone. A crash of thunder shook the building, followed by the distinctive crack of a large tree branch breaking. Outside, the storm continued, unabated water pooling in the gravel lot as drainage systems struggled to keep up. The power flickered once, twice, then failed completely, plunging the garage into darkness. Lily's voice called out, a note of fear evident. Dad Matthew moved instinctively toward his daughter's voice. "Right here, sweetheart. Let me find the lanterns." Before he could fumble his way to the supply shelf, several small lights illuminated around the garage. Tactical flashlights produced by the steel roses, their beams cutting efficiently through the darkness. Alex directed two of the women to establish perimeter lighting, creating a soft, ambient glow that dispelled the worst of the shadows. Matthew located his battery lanterns, setting them up around the central area of the garage. The combined light sources created a strangely intimate atmosphere, shadows dancing across walls as rain continued to hammer against the roof. One of the women, tall with close-cropped blonde hair, had moved to the window. "Streets are flooding. Palmer Creek must have jumped its banks." Alex joined her, concern evident in her profile. "We made the right call stopping. Highway would be a death trap now." Lily had edged closer to Matthew, her initial fears subsiding as the emergency lighting stabilized. The steel roses had reorganized themselves efficiently, some checking supplies, others continuing their quiet conversations. Jessie had produced a small sketch pad of her own and was showing Lily techniques for drawing in low light. The normalcy of it all struck Matthew suddenly. These supposed dangerous criminals adapting to circumstances with discipline and consideration, making the best of an uncomfortable situation without complaint. It contrasted sharply with Bennett's apocalyptic warnings about danger and violence. Movement near the side door caught his attention. Alex was checking the locks, testing the stability of the windows nearby. Her methodical approach reminded him of his squad leader in Afghanistan, always securing the perimeter, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Old habits. She glanced at him, a flash of recognition in her eyes. Hard to shake. 20 years and 10 years out, still sleep facing the door. The casual admission of vulnerability surprised him. Most veterans kept such things to themselves, especially around civilians. But perhaps she'd recognized him as someone who would understand who shared the same ingrained behaviors. The lights won't be back on tonight. Matthew gestured toward the powerless equipment around them. But the camping stove works, and there's food enough for everyone. Alex shook her head. We have our own rations. Won't take what's meant for your family. Another small revelation of character. Matthew had encountered enough entitled people to appreciate the difference. Well, the offer stands. For coffee, at least. A hint of a genuine smile crossed her face, quickly suppressed. Coffee's never unwelcome. Outside, the wind howled with renewed intensity, rattling the windows. A new sound joined the storm's fury. Voices, multiple people approaching. Matthew moved to the window, peering out into the rain/darkness. A group of men had gathered across the street, their faces barely visible in the beam of flashlights. He recognized Robert Coleman among them, along with several other business owners from Main Street. They're still watching the place. Alex had joined him at the window, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Concerned citizens with nothing better to do during a natural disaster. The bitterness in her tone suggested this wasn't the first time the Steel Roses had faced such scrutiny. Matthew wondered what other receptions they'd encountered on their travels, how many doors had been closed to them based on reputation alone. They won't do anything with the sheriff aware. Miller's fair-minded. Alex didn't seem convinced, but she nodded all the same. Best post watches through the night anyway. My women will take shifts. Matthew didn't argue. The precaution seemed reasonable given the circumstances, though he doubted Oak Ridge's concerned citizens would risk Sheriff Miller's wrath by taking direct action. Still, the tension outside added another layer of unease to an already challenging situation. Across the garage, Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, curled beneath a blanket Jesse had found. The young biker sat nearby, keeping watch with an expression that suggested she took the responsibility seriously. Gabe had organized a small medical station, checking on a woman with what appeared to be a sprained wrist. The others had settled into various rest positions, some dozing, others alert. Matthew found himself wondering about their stories, what had brought these women together, what kept them loyal to each other, when the world seemed determined to view them with suspicion and fear. As if sensing his thoughts, Alex spoke quietly. Most of us met through veteran support groups, some through VA hospitals, a few in less pleasant circumstances. Matthew waited, sensing she had more to say. Military taught us structure, purpose, brotherhood, sisterhood in our case. Coming home, the world doesn't understand what we carry, what we've seen, what we've done. She gestured toward the sleeping women. Steel Roses gave us back what civilian life took away. Belonging, purpose, family. The simple explanation carried profound weight. Matthew had found his purpose in Lily in being the father she needed. But he understood the void these women had filled for each other, the support they provided in a world that often viewed veterans as either heroes or broken people with little room for the complex reality in between. A sharp knock at the side door interrupted the moment. Matthew tensed, wondering if Bennett had returned with reinforcements despite Miller's warnings. But when he opened the door, he found Margaret Wilson standing in the rain, her 80-year-old frame dwarfed by a massive yellow raincoat. "Margaret, what are you doing out in this?" The elderly woman pushed past him into the garage, shaking water from her coat like a determined spaniel. "Heard you had visitors. Thought they might need these." She thrust a basket toward Matthew. Inside were several loaves of freshly baked bread, still warm, and jars of homemade jam. Margaret had been Oak Ridge's librarian for 40 years before retiring and was respected by all for her no-nonsense approach to community matters. The Steel Roses had tensed at the newcomer's arrival, but Margaret's appearance, 5 feet of elderly determination with rain-speckled glasses, hardly presented a threat. Alex stepped forward, curiosity evident in her expression. Margaret peered up at the Steel Roses leader, adjusting her glasses for a better look. "Lord above it is you, Alexandra Reeves, Staff Sergeant Force Recon, Purple Heart recipient." Alex's expression shifted from wariness to confusion. Ma'am Margaret thrust the basket into Alex's unprepared hands. "My grandson served with you. Michael Wilson, Helmand Province, 2009. You pulled him from that burned-out Humvee when everyone else thought it was too late." Realization dawned on Alex's face, followed quickly by shock. The basket trembled slightly in her hands. "Michael survived, walks with a limp and some nasty scars, but he's alive. Got 3 kids now, elementary school principal in Eugene." Emotion flickered across Alex's features, relief, pride, wonder, before she carefully controlled her expression. I didn't know. After the medevac took him, we moved positions. Never heard what happened. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He never forgot what you did. None of us did. The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the garage. The steel roses, sensing something significant had occurred, had drawn closer. Gabe placed a supportive hand on Alex's shoulder as the leader struggled to process this unexpected connection. Margaret, apparently finished with emotional matters, turned to address the room at large. Now, who needs dry socks? I've brought extras. And don't any of you give me that "we're fine" nonsense. I raised 5 boys. I know wet feet when I see them. Her no-nonsense approach broke the tension. Several of the women accepted her offerings with murmured thanks, while others helped distribute the bread, which proved to be still warm from the oven. Margaret herself commandeered the camping stove, producing a kettle from seemingly nowhere and preparing tea with military efficiency. Matthew watched this transformation with amazement. One elderly woman had accomplished what Sheriff Miller and Mayor Bennett could not. She had humanized the situation, turning a tense standoff into something approaching normalcy. Margaret treated the Steel Roses not as dangerous outlaws, but as guests in need of hospitality, and they responded accordingly, their wariness giving way to cautious appreciation. As the night deepened, the storm showed no signs of abating. Rain continued to pound against the roof, wind howling around corners, thunder rumbling overhead. But inside the garage, a different atmosphere had developed. Small groups had formed. Margaret holding court among several of the older Roses, sharing stories and photographs of her grandson. Jesse and 2 others examining Lily's artwork with genuine interest. Gabe discussing something mechanical with Matthew near the workbench. Alex remained somewhat apart, moving between groups, checking the perimeter, maintaining her role as leader even in these strange circumstances. But the rigid tension in her shoulders had eased somewhat, and occasionally Matthew caught her watching the interactions with what might have been satisfaction. When she eventually made her way to where Matthew was explaining the generator's issues to Gabe, her expression was thoughtful. Your neighbor, Margaret, she's something else. Oak Ridge's unofficial matriarch. Not even the mayor crosses her. Alex smiled slightly. Reminds me of my drill sergeant. 5'0" woman who could reduce 6-foot men to tears with a glance. Gabe laughed, a surprisingly warm sound. Remember Staff Sergeant Rodriguez? You call that a push-up? My dead grandmother could do better, and she was cremated. The shared military humor created another moment of connection. Matthew found himself smiling too, remembering similar characters from his own training days. The rigid boundaries between host and guest, between civilian and bikers, between strangers, thrust together by circumstance, were gradually dissolving as the night progressed. Lily had awakened and was now sitting with Jesse and another rider named Tanya, learning how to play poker with pretzels as chips. Her initial fear had transformed into fascination, especially when she discovered that Tanya had been a helicopter mechanic in the Army. You fixed actual helicopters, like the big ones. Tanya nodded, arranging her cards. Blackhawks mostly, some Apaches. One time had to patch up a Chinook that took fire during extraction. That was a challenge. Lily's eyes widened with admiration. That's way cooler than what they teach us in school. The casual conversation, the normalcy of it, struck Matthew powerfully. Here was his daughter interacting with women who most of Oak Ridge viewed as dangerous criminals, learning and connecting without fear. She saw them not as their reputation, but as individuals with stories and skills and humanity. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, drawing everyone's attention. Alex moved to check the security of the doors as the storm seemed to intensify rather than diminish. Outside, the watchers had apparently given up their vigil, driven away by the worsening weather. The flooding had likely worsened too. Palmer Creek overflowing its banks would threaten several low-lying areas of town. Matthew's phone buzzed. A text from Sheriff Miller. Creek's flooding downtown. All emergency personnel responding. Stay put. Keep your guests contained. He showed the message to Alex, who frowned. Your sheriff still thinks we're the biggest threat to this town tonight. Matthew pocketed the phone. Old habits. Alex acknowledged the echo of her earlier words with a slight nod. She glanced around at her women, many now resting or engaged in quiet conversation. What happens in the morning when the storm passes? Matthew considered the question. Bennett would certainly return, possibly with reinforcements. The concerned citizens might resume their watch. The temporary truce created by the storm and Margaret's intervention could dissolve in daylight. That's tomorrow's problem. Alex studied him for a long moment. Not many people would have opened their door to us. Fewer would have stood against their neighbors to keep it open. Matthew shrugged, uncomfortable with the implied praise. Did what anyone should do. But they don't. Alex's voice had softened, a rare vulnerability showing through. That's the thing about coming home from war. You expect, I don't know, not parades or medals, just basic dignity, recognition that you're still human. She glanced toward her sleeping companions. Most of these women came home to nothing. No support, no understanding, just judgment and closed doors. The quiet admission revealed more about the steel roses than any news report or rumor had conveyed. Matthew thought about his own return, how difficult it had been to readjust, how fortunate he'd been to have Sarah waiting, to have a community that, while not always understanding, had at least accepted him back without question. What happened in Eugene? The shooting. Alex's expression hardened slightly. Midnight Skulls. Male motorcycle club with territorial issues. Don't like women in the life, especially ex-military women. Followed one of my youngest, Jessie, after she left a bar. 3 of them, one of her. She managed to call us before they cornered her. We responded. They escalated. Shots were fired. She paused. We didn't start it, but we finished it. No one died, but the Skulls won't forget. And the media only reported half the story. Matthew could fill in the blanks. A female motorcycle club involved in violence made for better headlines than the context that might explain their actions. Protection of their own became gang warfare in the public narrative. The conversation was interrupted by a tremendous crash from outside. The building shook slightly, and several of the women leapt to their feet. Alex moved swiftly to the window, Matthew close behind. A massive oak tree had fallen across the street, its enormous root system torn from the saturated ground by the storm's fury. Power lines tangled in its branches sparked dangerously before going dark. The road was completely blocked, the water pooling around the massive trunk. No one's getting in or out that way till crews clear it. Matthew stated the obvious, but something in Alex's expression gave him pause. This bothers you? She turned to him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Mayor Bennett struck me as the type to escalate when challenged. Tree blocking access means delayed response if he decides to make a point about our presence. The assessment wasn't paranoid given Bennett's earlier behavior. Matthew found himself reconsidering the man's parting words, the barely veiled hostility in his expression. Bennett was the type to hold grudges, to take perceived disrespect personally, and the Steel Rose's very existence, women claiming space traditionally held by men veterans who didn't fit the heroic mold the public preferred, might represent a challenge to everything Bennett thought the world should be. We'll deal with that if it happens. Alex didn't seem reassured, but she nodded. Across the garage, her women had noted the fallen tree, but returned to their activities, trusting their leader to handle any developments. The atmosphere remained calm despite the ominous crash. As the night deepened toward early morning, exhaustion began to claim even the most resilient. The Steel Roses had organized sleeping shifts, some resting while others maintained watch. Margaret had finally been persuaded to take the couch where she now dozed peacefully, her glasses folded neatly beside her. Lily had fallen asleep again, this time on a makeshift bed of blankets near the workbench, Jessie keeping watch nearby. Matthew checked his phone. Still no service, the storm having disrupted cell towers. The battery was low anyway. He set it aside and moved to make another round of the garage's perimeter, checking windows and doors. Alex joined him without comment, the 2 of them falling into the synchronized movements of soldiers performing a familiar task. They completed the circuit in comfortable silence, ending near the side door where they'd first encountered each other. Outside, the storm continued unabated, though perhaps with slightly less fury than before. Dawn was still hours away. What will you do when you leave here? The question surprised him, breaking the silence unexpectedly. Alex seemed equally surprised that she'd asked it. Go on with life, fix cars, raise my daughter, one day at a time, and your town. After they saw you choose us over them. Matthew hadn't considered the potential consequences of his decision beyond the immediate night. Oak Ridge had been his home for 12 years. The garage had been his and Sarah's dream. A place of their own, a business built from scratch. After her death, the town had rallied around him and Lily, bringing food, offering childcare, keeping him afloat during the worst days of grief. But tonight, those same neighbors had looked at him with suspicion, with judgment, with disappointment, because he had opened his door to strangers in need, because he'd chosen compassion over caution. They'll come around, or they won't. Can't control what other people think. Alex studied him with newfound respect. You live by that dog tag, don't you? Honor before fear. Matthew touched the silver tags at his neck, feeling the engraved words beneath his fingers. Sarah had them made for him when he returned from his second tour, a reminder of who he was beneath the changes war had wrought, beneath the nightmares and hypervigilance, in moments of disassociation. Try to. Don't always succeed. Alex's gaze held understanding rather than judgment. The simplicity of their exchange belied its depth. Two veterans acknowledging the daily struggle to live by the values they'd sworn to uphold, even when the world made it difficult, even when fear and judgment and trauma pulled them in other directions. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Flashlight beams cut through the rain-swept darkness, voices raised in alarm. Matthew opened the side door cautiously, peering out into the storm. A group of people was making its way down the flooded street, led by Deputy Carson, his uniform soaked and muddy. Deputy, what is happening? Carson's face was grim in the flashlight's beam. Downtown's underwater. Creek broke through the retaining wall near the post office. We're evacuating low-lying areas. Mayor sent me to check if you needed assistance. The implication was clear. Bennett hadn't forgotten about the steel roses, even with a natural disaster unfolding. Matthew glanced at the group behind Carson, local volunteers with determined expressions, some carrying emergency supplies, others simply lending strength to the evacuation effort. We're fine here. Higher ground. But if others need shelter. Carson nodded, understanding Matthew's offer. Mayor set up the high school gym as the main evacuation center, but we're short on vehicles that can navigate the flooded streets. His gaze moved past Matthew to where Alex stood in the doorway. Heard your group rides Harleys. They any good in deep water? Alex stepped forward, assessing the situation with military precision. Bikes are no good in this, but we have skills, combat training, water rescue experience for some. Carson seemed to wrestle with internal directives versus immediate need. Finally, practicality won. Could use the help at the senior living facility on Maple. 5 residents still unaccounted for. Alex turned to the garage interior where her women were already mobilizing, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Gabe, Tanya, Chris, water rescue experience. Jesse, Rachel, Diane, strong swimmers. Rest of you prepare here, will likely bring people back. She looked to Matthew. That work for you, using this as secondary shelter? Matthew nodded without hesitation. Deputy Carson seemed momentarily taken aback by the swift, coordinated response, but recovered quickly. I'll take the first team to Maple Street. Others can assist with sandbagging at the elementary school. They're trying to keep the water from reaching the generator. Within minutes, the Steel Roses had organized into teams, donning rain gear, checking equipment, preparing to venture into the storm-ravaged town. The transformation was remarkable. From unwelcome outsiders to emergency responders in the space of a conversation. Alex directed her women with calm efficiency, assigning tasks based on experience and ability, ensuring each team had proper communication and clear objectives. Matthew found himself impressed despite already revised expectations. These women functioned like a well-oiled military unit, adapting to changing circumstances without complaint, focusing on the mission rather than their own comfort or safety. As the first team prepared to depart with Deputy Carson, Alex turned to Matthew. Keep an eye on the rest for me. The request, simple, direct, trusting, carried weight beyond its words. She was placing half her women in his care, demonstrating a level of trust rarely extended to outsiders. They'll be safe here. Alex nodded once, then joined the departure team. Within moments, they had vanished into the storm, leaving the garage quieter but buzzing with purposeful energy as the remaining Roses prepared for potential evacuees. Lily had awakened during the commotion and now stood beside Matthew, watching the preparations with wide eyes. Where are they going to help people who are stuck in the flood? Matthew placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling a surge of pride, both in the Roses' response and in his daughter's concern. Storm's getting worse downtown. Lily considered this information with the seriousness only a child can muster. But everyone said they were dangerous. The mayor said they were criminals. The simple observation cut to the heart of the night's events. Matthew knelt beside his daughter, meeting her eyes. Sometimes people get things wrong. Sometimes they judge others without knowing the whole story. Like when Tommy's dad said you were scary because you don't talk much. But Tommy knows you're not scary at all. Matthew smiled at the comparison. Something like that, yes. Lily nodded, accepting this explanation with a child's adaptability. Then she moved to help Margaret, who was organizing blankets for potential evacuees with the energy of a woman half her age. The garage had transformed in preparation for new arrivals. Tools cleared away space, made for additional people supplies, organized efficiently. The remaining steel roses worked alongside Margaret with synchronized purpose, their earlier wariness replaced by focused determination. Outside, the storm continued to rage, wind and rain battering the building with undiminished fury. But inside, something had shifted fundamentally. The boundaries between outsiders and community, between the judged and the judges, had begun to dissolve in the face of common purpose and shared humanity. As Matthew helped prepare space for evacuees, he caught sight of his dog tags momentarily exposed as he leaned forward. Honor before fear. In opening his door to the steel roses and standing against his neighbor's judgment, in choosing compassion over caution, he had lived those words more truly than perhaps at any moment since returning from war. The night was far from over. Dawn would bring new challenges. Bennett's continuing hostility, the town's judgment, the eventual departure of the steel roses. But in this moment, as strangers became allies in the face of nature's fury, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The pure clarity of purpose that comes from knowing beyond doubt that you have done the right thing regardless of consequence. Honor before fear, indeed. The first evacuees arrived just before dawn, an elderly couple from River Street and a young mother with twin toddlers whose basement apartment had flooded while they slept. They entered the garage with wide eyes soaked to the bone and trembling from cold and fear. The remaining steel roses moved with practiced efficiency, providing blankets, hot drinks, dry clothes from the emergency supplies they'd pooled together. Margaret took charge of the children, her grandmotherly demeanor instantly calming their frightened cries. Outside, the storm had reached its peak. The wind howled with renewed fury, driving rain sideways against the windows. Palmer Creek had swollen beyond recognition, transforming from a gentle stream to a raging torrent that devoured riverbanks and threatened the very foundations of Oak Ridge. The police scanner that Deputy Carson had left behind crackled with emergency transmissions. Roads washed out power lines down residents trapped in second-story rooms as his water rose below. Lily watched the new arrivals with solemn curiosity, helping where she could by entertaining the twins, while their exhausted mother accepted a cup of steaming tea from one of the bikers. Matthew observed his daughter's easy compassion with quiet pride. She had her mother's intuitive kindness, the ability to set others at ease, even in the most difficult circumstances. More evacuees trickled in over the next hour. A teenage boy who'd been separated from his family when their car stalled in rising water, an older man with a service dog who'd been rescued from his flooded garage apartment, two college students whose dormitory had lost part of its roof. Each was met with the same efficient care, the steel roses working in tandem with Margaret to address immediate needs without unnecessary questions or judgment. Alex and her rescue team returned as the sky began to lighten imperceptibly behind the storm clouds. They brought 5 more evacuees, residents from the senior living facility who'd been trapped when an electrical fire forced evacuation into the flooded streets. The women were soaked and exhausted, faces etched with the strain of hours spent wading through dangerous waters, carrying those who couldn't walk, navigating around debris and hidden hazards. Alex found Matthew organizing sleeping arrangements enough for the newest arrivals. Her short hair was plastered to her head, her clothes sodden despite rain gear. Exhaustion showed in the shadows beneath her eyes, but something else burned there too. Purpose, satisfaction, the particular energy that comes from successfully completing a difficult mission. Towns underwater from Main Street to the river. Emergency crews are overwhelmed. Backup from Eugene can't get through. Highways blocked in 3 places. Matthew handed her a towel, which she accepted with a grateful nod. Sheriff Miller coordinating from the high school. Bennett's there too, trying to take charge. She wiped her face, lowering her voice. Your mayor's not exactly rising to the occasion. More concerned with assigning blame than solving problems. Matthew wasn't surprised. Bennett had always been better at grand pronouncements than practical action. When did you sleep last? Alex shrugged off the question. I'll rest when the chew's done. The job's never done. That's the first thing they should teach in the Marines. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, acknowledgement of the shared understanding between them. Maybe they did. I never was good at listening in class. Their moment of connection was interrupted by Gabe, who approached with medical supplies gathered from her saddlebag. Maple Street rescue team's back. Rachel's got a gash on her arm, glass from a broken window. Nothing serious but needs cleaning. Alex nodded, instantly refocused on her responsibilities. As she turned to follow Gabe, she paused, glancing back at Matthew. Your daughter's something else. Saw her with those twins. Natural caretaker. The simple observation carried weight, coming from a woman who led others through both war and peace. Matthew watched Alex walk away, noting how the other women instinctively made space for her, how they oriented themselves around her presence like planets around a sun. Not just respect for authority, but something deeper. Trust, loyalty, perhaps even love. By mid-morning, the garage had transformed into a makeshift refugee center. 23 evacuees now crowded the space, ranging in age from the twin toddlers to a 92-year-old former math teacher who regaled anyone who would listen with stories from Oak Ridge's earlier days. The Steel Roses had organized themselves into rotating shifts, some resting, while others managed food distribution, medical needs, comfort measures for the stressed evacuees. The storm had begun to slacken slightly, the howling wind reduced to occasional gusts, the pounding rain softening to a steady drizzle. But reports from the police scanner indicated the danger was far from over. The creek continued to rise as runoff from the mountains fed the already swollen waters. New areas of town faced evacuation orders. The highway remained impassable. Oak Ridge was, for all practical purposes, cut off from outside help. Matthew worked alongside the Roses, his mechanical skills put to use repairing the generator that powered the emergency radio, fixing a broken wheelchair for one of the elderly evacuees, rigging additional light sources from spare batteries and bulbs. Lily had become the unofficial entertainer of the younger children, organizing quiet games that distracted them from their parents' worried conversations. Jesse approached as Matthew finished securing a loose window shutter. That daughter of yours could teach art therapy when she grows up. Got those twins drawing pictures of superhero bikers saving the town instead of crying about their flooded home. Matthew glanced across the room where Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, demonstrating how to draw a motorcycle while the twins watched with rapt attention. He felt a familiar ache. Sarah should have been here to see this, to witness the compassionate young woman their daughter was becoming. Takes after her mother. Always knew how to find light in dark places. Jesse's expression softened with understanding. Lost mine too. Cancer 3 years ago. Still hits me sometimes like a punch to the chest when I least expect it. The unexpected connection lingered between them. Shared grief, shared understanding of that particular hollow space that never quite fills again. Jessie touched the scar on her jaw absently. Mom's the one who taught me to ride. Harley Softail said every woman should know how to drive something that made men nervous. The memory brought a fleeting smile to her face before she refocused on the present. Alex wants everyone in the main area. Town update coming through on the emergency channel. The evacuees and their caretakers gathered around the crackling radio. Sheriff Miller's voice came through, strained with fatigue, but steady with authority. Palmer Creek Dam is at capacity. Engineers report potential structural compromise. As a precautionary measure, we're expanding the evacuation zone to include all areas within half a mile of the creek bed. I repeat, all residents within half a mile of Palmer Creek need to evacuate immediately to higher ground. Murmurs of alarm spread through the assembled group. The dam, built in the 1960s to create a reservoir for Oak Ridge's water supply, was located 3 miles upstream from town. If it failed, the resulting flood would devastate everything in its path. Alex moved to a map of Oak Ridge pinned to the wall, part of the emergency resources Deputy Carson had left behind. She traced the creek's path with her finger, calculating distances, assessing threats with military precision. Her women gathered around, awaiting direction with practiced readiness. Matthew joined them, scanning the map with the eye of someone who knew every street and building in town. If the dam goes, everything from Pine Street to the highway is in the direct path. That includes the high school evacuation center. Alex nodded grimly. Miller must know that. They'll be moving people. But to where Oak Ridge's geography worked against it in this situation? nestled in a valley with mountains on three sides and the river on the fourth. The highest points in town were already crowded with evacuees. Resources were stretched to breaking, and the continuing rain meant the situation would likely worsen before it improved. The decision crystallized between them without need for debate. We need to take more people here. Most of the garage sits on bedrock, 10 feet above creek level. Not ideal, but better than the alternatives. Alex's women were already moving, reorganizing the space to accommodate additional evacuees, checking supplies, formulating plans. Matthew was struck again by their efficiency, their ability to adapt to changing circumstances without complaint or confusion. These were women who had faced worse than a flood, who had learned in the harshest of classrooms that survival often depended on quick decisions and coordinated action. As preparations continued, a commotion at the side door announced new arrivals. Deputy Carson entered, followed by a group of bedraggled evacuees, mostly families with young children, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. The deputy's uniform was mud-stained and torn, his expression grim beneath his dripping hat. Dam engineers say we've got hours at most before potential failure. Sheriff's moving the high school group to the church on Hillside Drive. Mayor wanted me to check if you could take more here. Carson's gaze swept the garage, taking in the transformed space, the steel roses working alongside townspeople, the ordered response to chaos. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, reassessment, perhaps even a touch of respect. Matthew had known Carson for years, had seen him at town council meetings, at the annual 4th of July barbecue, at Sarah's funeral. But this was the first time he'd seen the deputy look at him with something approaching deference. We can take more. As many as you need to send. Alex stepped forward, naturally assuming her role as co-leader in this evolving crisis. We need information more than anything. Road conditions, projected creek levels, supply inventories across evacuation centers. Carson nodded, professional recognizing professional. I'll have the sheriff set up a communication relay. Radio every 30 minutes with updates. As the deputy turned to leave, he hesitated, glancing back at the steel roses now helping the new evacuees settle in. Mayor Bennett was wrong about your guests. Sheriff thought so too, but couldn't say it officially. Just wanted you to know. The simple acknowledgement carried weight, a small correction to the mischaracterization that had begun the night. Matthew watched Carson depart, noting how quickly perceptions could shift when circumstances stripped away preconceptions and revealed true character. By noon, the garage housed 37 evacuees, ranging from infants to the elderly. What had begun as an emergency shelter had evolved into a fully functional relief center. The Steel Roses had organized themselves and able-bodied evacuees into teams: food distribution, medical support, childcare, communication, security. The system functioned smoothly, each person finding their place in the response to crisis. Alex coordinated it all with calm efficiency, her military training evident in every decision, every delegation of responsibility. She moved through the crowded space like a commander on a battlefield, assessing needs, solving problems, providing the steady center around which everything else revolved. Matthew found himself working alongside her naturally, their partnership unspoken but effective. They communicated with the shorthand of those who share similar training, similar experiences. A nod, a gesture, a single word conveying complex meaning. The evacuees responded to their united leadership with trust, following directions without question, contributing where they could. Lily had become Alex's unofficial assistant, carrying messages between teams, helping distribute food, offering comfort to frightened children with a maturity beyond her years. Matthew observed his daughter's interaction with the Steel Roses leader. The attentive way Lily listened to instructions, the proud straightening of her shoulders when given responsibility, the growing admiration in her eyes. Alex approached as Matthew finished reinforcing a leaking window frame. Your daughter's already got the makings of a good officer. Clear-headed in crisis, thinks of others before herself. The assessment, professional rather than patronizing, carried weight. Matthew watched Lily help an elderly man to a more comfortable chair, her small face serious with concentration. Sometimes I worry I'm not enough for her, that she needs things I don't know how to give. The admission surprised him even as he spoke it aloud. These were thoughts he rarely articulated, vulnerabilities he typically kept guarded. But something about this woman, her strength, her understanding, her own evident vulnerabilities, made honesty feel not only possible, but necessary. Alex's expression softened, revealing the person beneath the leader. All parents feel that way. Difference is, most don't have the self-awareness to recognize it. She gestured toward Lily, now teaching a clapping game to several younger children. She's kind, brave, resourceful. You're doing something right. Before Matthew could respond, the emergency radio crackled with a new transmission. Sheriff Miller's voice came through tension, evident beneath his professional tone. Dam engineers report accelerated structural compromise. Evacuation zone expanded to 1 mile from all waterways. All emergency personnel and volunteers report to their nearest evacuation center for new assignments. Projected time to potential dam failure now 2 hours. I repeat, 2 hours. The news sent a ripple of fear through the assembled evacuees. Voices rose in alarm questions, overlapping panic threatening to take hold. Alex moved immediately to the center of the room, her presence commanding attention without need for shouted orders. Listen up. We have a clear situation and a clear response plan. This location remains safe. We're well above the projected flood zone. All teams continue current assignments. Communication team establish contact with the other evacuation centers to coordinate resources. Security team prepare for possible additional evacuees. Medical team inventory supplies for treatment of potential injuries. The simple, direct instructions had an immediate calming effect. People returned to their tasks with renewed purpose, fear channeled into productive action rather than panic. Matthew recognized the technique from his military days. In crisis, people needed clarity, direction, the sense that someone competent was in control. Alex turned to him, her voice lowered for his ears alone. We should check the perimeter, make sure the building's structure remains sound if water levels rise further. They moved through the garage together, inspecting foundations, evaluating potential weaknesses, devising contingency plans. The work was practical, necessary, but Matthew sensed Alex had another purpose in mind, creating a moment of privacy amid the crowded chaos, a chance to speak openly, away from watchful eyes and listening ears. Your town will be different after this. Disasters change places, change people. Wash away what isn't essential. The observation carried the weight of personal experience. Matthew wondered what disasters, beyond war, beyond whatever had brought her to the Steel Roses, she had weathered in her life, what non-essential elements had been washed away in her own floods. For better or worse, she considered the question seriously, taking time to formulate her answer as they examined a slightly bowed window frame. Both. Always both. Destruction makes space for rebuilding. But what gets built isn't always what stood before. Matthew thought about Oak Ridge, about the town it had been, and the town it might become after the waters receded. About Bennett's vision of progress that excluded those who didn't fit his narrow definition of desirable. About the divisions revealed by the arrival of strangers in need. About how quickly those divisions had dissolved when faced with genuine crisis. Doesn't have to be worse, though. Could be stronger. More honest about what matters. Alex's eyes met his understanding passing between them. That takes leadership. Vision. Courage to stand against those who want to rebuild the exact same walls that fell. The conversation was interrupted by commotion at the side door. Sheriff Miller himself, this time accompanied by 2 deputies and a group of newly displaced evacuees. The sheriff's uniform was mud-stained and torn, his normally composed face haggard with exhaustion. But his eyes were clear, his voice steady as he approached Matthew and Alex. Dam's not going to hold. Engineers say complete failure within the hour. We're moving everyone from the church. Building's old foundations already showing stress from the saturated ground. Need to bring them here. Alex assessed the situation instantly. How many? 47, including medical cases. Old folks, mostly some with mobility issues. Mayors with them. The mention of Bennett added a new complication, but neither Alex nor Matthew hesitated. The Steel Roses were already moving, reorganizing the space to accommodate the new arrivals, preparing medical stations, clearing pathways for wheelchairs and stretchers. Sheriff will need additional medical supplies. And information on special needs before they arrive. Oxygen dependencies, medication requirements, mobility limitations. Miller nodded, recognizing Alex not as an outsider or a potential criminal, but as a crucial ally in the town's hour of need. I'll radio ahead with details. First transport arrives in 15 minutes. As the sheriff departed to coordinate the transfer, Matthew and Alex moved through the garage, directing preparations with synchronized efficiency. The space that had begun as a simple repair shop less than 24 hours ago had transformed into the heart of Oak Ridge's emergency response, and the steel roses once viewed with suspicion and fear had become essential to the town's survival. The first group from the church arrived as predicted. Elderly residents in wheelchairs pushed by volunteers, medical cases carried on stretchers, improvised from doors and tables, families with young children trailing behind. Among them walked Mayor Bennett, his expensive suit ruined by mud and water, his normally impeccable hair plastered to his head, his face a mask of controlled fury. Bennett surveyed the garage with poorly concealed disdain, his gaze lingering on the steel roses as they helped transfer medical patients to prepared cots, distributed blankets, provided hot drinks to shivering evacuees. His expression darkened further when he spotted Matthew and Alex working side by side, directing the operation with natural authority that overshadowed his own official position. He approached them shoulders squared with attempted dignity despite his bedraggled appearance. "Sheriff Miller may have deemed this location necessary, but I want it on record that I object to placing vulnerable citizens in the care of known criminals." Alex didn't flinch, her expression remaining professionally neutral. "Your objection is noted, Mayor. Now, unless you're here to help with the medical transfers, I suggest you move aside. We have lives to save." The dismissal was polite but absolute. For a moment, Bennett seemed ready to explode with indignation. But a call for help from the medical team diverted Alex's attention, and she moved away without waiting for his response, leaving him standing alone, his authority diminished by crisis and his own inability to adapt to it. Matthew remained meeting Bennett's angry gaze with calm assessment. There are seniors who need assistance to the restroom, children who need comfort, people who've lost everything and need reassurance. Plenty of ways to be useful if you're looking for something to do. He didn't wait for a response either, turning instead to help an elderly man struggling to navigate the crowded space with his walker. Behind him, he could feel Bennett's glare like heat against his back, the promise of future consequences, when crisis no longer demanded unity, when the waters receded and power dynamics reasserted themselves. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today required focus on immediate needs, on survival, on the practical task of keeping 50-plus people safe, warm-fed, and calm in the face of natural disaster. By mid-afternoon, the garage housed 84 evacuees, nearly a tenth of Oak Ridge's total population. The space was crowded beyond comfort, but organized with military precision. The Steel Roses had integrated local volunteers into their team structure, creating a remarkably effective emergency response unit that transcended previous divisions of insider versus outsider, resident versus stranger. Even Sheriff Miller had acknowledged their effectiveness, relying increasingly on Alex's tactical experience as the crisis evolved. The two had established a professional rapport, coordinating resources between evacuation centers, sharing information about road conditions, water levels, and developing threats. The sheriff's initial wariness had given way to respectful collaboration, recognition of a valuable ally, rather than a potential problem. Bennett, however, remained a simmering presence at the margins, watching the Steel Roses with undisguised suspicion, documenting perceived infractions in a small notebook, gathering ammunition for future use. His authority effectively superseded by natural disaster and his own inadequate response to it, he had retreated to what he knew best: bureaucratic maneuvering, the accumulation of grievances, preparation for political battles to come. Matthew observed the mayor's isolation with a mixture of pity and wariness. A man like Bennett, publicly humiliated and privately seething, would not forget or forgive easily. The consequences would come later, when the immediate crisis passed, when the community's gratitude toward the Steel Roses faded, when old prejudices reasserted themselves in the absence of shared danger. Alex joined him by the window, where he watched water continue to rise in the street outside, flowing like a river where cars had passed just yesterday. Sheriff radioed, "Dams holding better than expected. Engineers reinforced the north face. Might buy us another few hours before failure." A small reprieve, but welcome nonetheless. Each hour meant more time for additional evacuations, more time for emergency crews to reach isolated residents, more time for distant help to navigate blocked roads and arrive with fresh resources. Matthew studied Alex's profile as she gazed out at the transformed landscape. Exhaustion had begun to show in the shadows beneath her eyes, a slight slump of shoulders normally held military straight. She had been in constant motion since arriving nearly 24 hours ago, managing crises, solving problems, leading both her women and an increasingly complex emergency operation without complaint or hesitation. When did you last sleep? Really sleep, not just a 20-minute combat nap. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You sound like Gabe. She's the mother hen of our group. You didn't answer the question. Alex shrugged, dismissing her own needs as irrelevant. Sleep when the job's done. Learned that in the Marines. Some things stick. Matthew recognized the deflection, the ingrained habit of putting mission before self, of pushing physical limitations beyond what civilians would consider reasonable or healthy. He had done the same in Afghanistan, functioning on minimal sleep for days during critical operations, ignoring hunger, thirst, pain, until the objective was secured. But this wasn't combat, and even in war, leaders who failed to maintain themselves eventually failed their units. Rest isn't weakness, Staff Sergeant. It's tactical necessity. She turned to face him fully, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Surprised, perhaps, at being seen so clearly, at having her military mindset both recognized and gently challenged. Before she could respond, however, a commotion near the main entrance drew their attention. Lily stood there, her small face pale with shock, pointing toward the street. The evacuees nearest the windows were rising from their makeshift beds, voices raised in alarm. Matthew and Alex moved as one, pushing through the crowded space to see what had caused the disturbance. Outside, the world had transformed yet again. Where there had been a flooded street an hour before, there was now a raging river. The water had risen with shocking speed, carrying debris, tree branches, sections of fencing, someone's garden shed, in its churning current. The dam had failed, sending its deadly payload downstream toward the heart of Oak Ridge. Alex reacted instantly. Security team to the doors. Ensure all entries are secured against water pressure. Medical team prepare for possible relocation to second floor if water breaches the building. Communication team contact Sheriff Miller for situation report. All other teams assist evacuees away from windows and exterior walls. The Steel Roses moved with practiced precision, their training evident in every coordinated action. Local volunteers followed their lead, helping elderly residents to more secure positions, calming frightened children, reinforcing vulnerable entry points with whatever materials could be found. Matthew found Lily helping a young mother with twins, her small hands steady as she gathered their scattered belongings, her voice calm as she directed them toward the garage's interior. The sight filled him with fierce pride, his daughter rising to crisis with courage beyond her years, finding strength where fear might have overwhelmed others. Outside, the floodwaters continued to rise, now lapping at the garage's foundation, testing the strength of doors and windows designed for security against human threats rather than natural disasters. The building groaned under the assault, old timbers, creaking metal fixtures, straining against mounting pressure. A particularly violent surge sent water spraying through a gap in the side doors, weather stripping. The leak was minor but symbolic. The outside world breaching their sanctuary, the illusion of complete safety dissolving with each passing minute. Bennett seized upon the development, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere with accusatory force. This location isn't secure. We need to evacuate to higher ground before we're all trapped. His words sent a ripple of fear through the already stressed evacuees. Voices rose in concern, questions overlapping the fragile calm, threatening to shatter into panic. Matthew stepped forward, prepared to intervene, but Alex moved first, her presence commanding immediate attention. This building sits on bedrock, 10 feet above normal creek level. The foundation is reinforced concrete. The structure has withstood 70 years of Oak Ridge winters. We are not evacuating into a flash flood situation where people would be carried away by the current. Her voice remained steady, authoritative, without shouting, confident, without bravado. She addressed the frightened evacuees, directly meeting their eyes, acknowledging their fear, while redirecting it toward productive action. Every person in this room has a role to play. Every hand is needed. Every voice matters. We will secure this building. We will protect each other. And when the water recedes, we will rebuild what was lost. Together. The simple speech transformed the atmosphere, replacing incipient panic with renewed purpose. People returned to their tasks with straightened shoulders and lifted chins, fear still present but no longer controlling. Bennett's attempt to assert authority through alarm had failed completely, leaving him more isolated than before, his political instincts revealed as inadequate to genuine crisis. Sheriff Miller's voice crackled over the emergency radio, confirming what they already knew. The dam had partially failed, sending a surge of water downstream. The good news was that the failure was not complete. Engineers had managed to stabilize portions of the structure, preventing a catastrophic collapse that would have completely devastated the town. The bad news was that water levels would continue to rise for at least 2 more hours before the surge passed. All evacuation centers were to remain in place, movement between locations deemed too dangerous given the rapidly changing conditions. Each center would need to be self-sufficient until morning at minimum, possibly longer, depending on road conditions after the waters receded. Matthew relayed the information to Alex as she directed the reinforcement of vulnerable windows. Essentially, we're on our own until tomorrow. She nodded, unsurprised. Always plan for that scenario anyway. Military habit: expect supply lines to fail, communication to go dark, reinforcements to be delayed. Plan accordingly. The pragmatic approach, born of hard experience rather than pessimism, struck Matthew as both rational and oddly comforting. Alex wasn't hoping for the best while expecting the worst. She was simply preparing for all contingencies, refusing to bet lives on best-case scenarios that rarely materialized in crisis. Together, they moved through the crowded garage, checking structural integrity, reinforcing vulnerable points, reassuring frightened evacuees with their calm competence and united front. The Steel Roses followed their leader's example, working tirelessly despite their own exhaustion, finding solutions where others saw only problems. As twilight approached, the floodwaters reached their peak, lapping at the garage doors, seeping through minute gaps in the foundation, transforming the world outside into an alien landscape of water where streets and yards and gardens had been. Inside, evacuees huddled in the building's center, away from potentially compromised exterior walls, sharing blankets, food stories to distract from the continued danger. Matthew found Lily sitting with Jesse and several other children, teaching them to draw motorcycles with the serious concentration of an experienced instructor. The sight saw something tight in his chest. His daughter finding connection and purpose amid chaos, transforming fear into creativity, isolation into community. Alex appeared beside him, following his gaze to the impromptu art class. The change in her expression was subtle but significant. A softening around the eyes, a relaxing of the military bearing she maintained even in exhaustion. She's remarkable, has her father's steady hands and clear head. The compliment, simple but genuine, touched something in Matthew that had been closed since Sarah's death. Not just pride in his daughter, though that was certainly present, but recognition of himself as more than a grieving widower, more than a struggling single parent, as someone worthy of respect in his own right, someone whose qualities deserved acknowledgement and appreciation. Before he could respond, a sharp crack from the side wall snapped their attention away from the peaceful scene. A window frame had partially given way under water pressure, allowing a steady stream to pour into the garage. Evacuees scrambled away from the breach, voices rising in alarm as water spread across the concrete floor. Alex reacted instantly, calling for her security team even as she moved toward the damaged window. Together with Matthew and two of her women, she battled against the increasing pressure, using boards from a nearby shelving unit to reinforce the failing frame ceiling gaps with whatever materials came to hand: rags, duct tape, a rubber floor mat. The repair was makeshift but effective, stemming the immediate crisis even as water continued to seep through in smaller, manageable amounts. Matthew's hands bled from a cut sustained on broken glass, but the adrenaline of emergency response dulled the pain to an irrelevant background sensation. They retreated from the secured window, soaked and breathing hard from the exertion. Alex caught Matthew's injured hand in hers, turning it to examine the wound with clinical efficiency. The casual contact sparked something unexpected, a current of awareness that had nothing to do with emergency response and everything to do with human connection. Gabe needs to clean this. Glass cuts infected easily. Her voice remained professional, but something had shifted in her eyes. Recognition of the moment between them, acknowledgement of connection beyond crisis management, beyond the roles they had assumed in this extraordinary circumstance. I've had worse. She didn't release his hand immediately. So have I. Doesn't mean this one doesn't matter. Dawn broke over Oak Ridge with deceptive gentleness, soft light illuminating a transformed landscape. The floodwaters had begun to recede during the night, leaving behind a world of mud and debris where ordered streets and tidy yards had once existed. Rooftops peaked above receding water like strange islands. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles. Some partially submerged, others perched improbably atop collapsed fences or crumpled against trees. The storm had passed, but its consequences remained written in destruction across the small town's face. Inside the garage, exhausted evacuees stirred from uncomfortable sleep. The night had been long punctuated by the groans of the building as it withstood the flood's assault by children's whimpers, quickly soothed by the constant vigilance of those who stood watch while others rested. Despite the discomfort and fear, all 84 evacuees had survived the night unharmed, a testament to preparation leadership in the strange alliance formed between Oak Ridge's residents and the women once viewed as dangerous outsiders. Matthew moved quietly through the crowded space, checking on sleeping families, reinforcing repairs that had weakened during the night, conferring with the Steel Roses who had maintained watch in rotating shifts. His body ached from tension and exertion. His cut hand throbbed beneath Gabe's careful bandaging. His mind felt dulled by too little sleep and too much responsibility. But beneath the physical discomfort burned a quiet satisfaction. They had weathered the crisis, protected the vulnerable, maintained order when chaos threatened to overwhelm. Sheriff Miller's first radio transmission of the day confirmed what they could see from the windows. The worst had passed. Water levels were dropping steadily as the dam's remaining structure channeled the flow. Emergency crews from Eugene had finally broken through on the highway, bringing fresh supplies and additional personnel. Rescue operations were underway in the hardest-hit areas. The immediate danger had ended. The long process of recovery had begun. Alex stood by the side door, surveying the scene outside with the focused assessment of a battlefield commander evaluating post-engagement conditions. The night's vigilance showed in the shadows beneath her eyes and the slight stiffness of her movements, but her posture remained straight, her gaze clear and steady. She turned as Matthew approached, nodding toward the waterlogged street. Road to the highway will be passable by noon. Creeks back within its banks mostly. Sheriff's setting up a central relief station at the library. It's on high ground, minimal damage. The practical information carried an unspoken weight. The Steel Roses would soon be able to depart, continuing their interrupted journey, leaving Oak Ridge and its inhabitants to rebuild without them. The thought created an unexpected hollowness in Matthew's chest, a sense of impending loss that surprised him with its intensity. Your women earned their place in Oak Ridge's history books last night. Town won't forget what you did. Alex's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a private reaction not meant for public consumption. Records like that don't often survive the cleanup. People have short memories when it comes to debts owed to outsiders. The assessment wasn't bitter, merely realistic. The voice of experience rather than resentment. Matthew wondered how many other towns the Steel Roses had helped, how many other crises they had weathered, how many times they had been essential in emergency and unwelcome once danger passed. Before he could respond, Mayor Bennett approached his expensive suit, now a ruined testament to the night's hardships. His face haggard, but his eyes sharp with renewed purpose. The political animal had survived the flood, emerging with teeth and claws intact. Sheriff Miller has requested all evacuees relocate to the central relief station by noon. The Red Cross has arrived with supplies, medical personnel, and proper facilities. The emphasis on proper carried clear meaning. The garage's emergency accommodations, however effective, were now deemed inadequate by official standards. Bennett's gaze swept dismissively over the Steel Roses working nearby, his meaning unmistakable. Their utility had ended. Their presence was no longer required or desired. Alex met his gaze evenly, neither challenging nor submitting to his renewed assertion of authority. We'll organize transportation for those unable to walk. Medical cases need special handling. Her tone remained professional, focused on practical matters rather than the obvious power play underlying Bennett's announcement. But Matthew caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the barely perceptible squaring of her shoulders. A soldier recognizing battle lines being drawn, preparing for engagement, even while maintaining diplomatic protocols. Bennett's attention shifted to Matthew, his expression hardening further. The town council will want a full accounting of resources used during this unauthorized evacuation center. I assume you've maintained proper records. The bureaucratic attack was predictable. When direct confrontation failed, Bennett typically retreated to regulations and paperwork weapons more suited to his particular skills. Matthew had seen the tactic deployed against other business owners who crossed. The mayor had heard the stories of sudden inspections, discovered violations, expensive compliance requirements imposed with selective rigor. We've been a bit busy saving lives, Mayor, but I'm sure we can reconstruct whatever documentation you need. The Steel Roses kept excellent records of all supplies distributed. The casual inclusion of the motorcycle club in his response was deliberate, a small but significant alignment that didn't escape Bennett's notice. The mayor's eyes narrowed, calculating potential consequences, reassessing strategy. I'm sure they did. Very thorough group, aren't they? Particularly for visitors just passing through. The insinuation hung in the air that the Steel Roses' presence wasn't coincidental, that their involvement carried hidden motives, that their assistance came with strings attached, or purposes yet revealed. Bennett's talent for subtle accusation without actionable defamation had served him well in small-town politics, allowing him to sow doubt without legal consequence. Alex stepped forward slightly, her movement casual, but her presence suddenly more commanding. Mayor Bennett, your town just survived a natural disaster because people set aside differences to work together. Might be a lesson worth remembering when the mud dries. The simple statement, delivered without heat, but with unmistakable authority, landed like a well-placed punch. Bennett's face flushed, his political mask slipping to reveal genuine anger beneath. But before he could respond, Sheriff Miller's arrival created a timely interruption. The sheriff looked like he'd aged years overnight, his uniform mud-stained and torn, his face lined with exhaustion, his movements weighted with the responsibility of a town in crisis. But his eyes remained sharp, his voice steady as he addressed the small group. Red Cross trucks can't access this street yet. Too much debris. Need volunteers with trucks or SUVs to help transport people to the central station. Anyone with medical training is needed there too. Got injured coming in from outlying areas. His gaze lingered on the Steel Roses working nearby, professional recognition of valuable resources rather than the suspicion that had marked their first encounter. The evolution wasn't lost on Bennett, whose expression darkened further at this additional evidence of shifting allegiances. Alex responded without hesitation. We've got 3 riders with medical backgrounds. I'll send them ahead with Gabe leading. The rest of us can help with transport and debris clearing to open access. The sheriff nodded, simple acceptance of practical assistance without political calculation. He turned to Matthew next, his expression shifting to something more personal, almost apologetic. Highway Patrol found Robert Coleman's body half a mile downstream from his store. Looks like he was trying to save inventory when the surge hit. Thought you should know before word spreads. The news landed like a physical blow. Robert, gruff, opinionated, but ultimately decent, had been Matthew's closest friend in Oak Ridge, particularly after Sarah's death. They had shared beers and fishing trips, complained about Bennett's policies, discussed the challenges of raising children in a changing world. His death transformed the flood from natural disaster to personal tragedy, immediate danger to lasting loss. The sheriff moved on to organize evacuation logistics, leaving Matthew momentarily adrift in private grief. Alex remained beside him, her presence solid but unobtrusive, respecting his pain without attempting premature comfort. When he finally looked up, her eyes held understanding rather than pity, the gaze of someone familiar with loss, with the sudden holes torn in life's fabric by death's unexpected visits. The moment between them lengthened, deepened, became something beyond words. Then Lily approached, pulling Matthew back to immediate responsibilities, to the world that continued, despite grief, to the needs that wouldn't pause for mourning. Throughout the morning, the garage slowly emptied as evacuees were transported to the central relief station. The Steel Roses worked with seamless efficiency, helping elderly residents navigate muddy terrain, carrying children through still flooded sections, loading what few belongings evacuees had managed to save. Matthew and Lily worked alongside them, part of the coordinated effort that transcended previous divisions of insider and outsider, resident and stranger. By noon, only the Steel Roses remained, cleaning the garage, repairing what damage they could, restoring order to the space that had sheltered so many through the long night of crisis. They moved with the synchronized coordination of a unit accustomed to working together, each woman knowing her role, without need for constant direction, accomplishing in hours what might have taken days for less organized volunteers. Matthew worked among them simultaneously, grateful for their help and increasingly aware of their impending departure. The roads were clearing. The sun had emerged from lingering clouds, beginning the long process of drying mud and standing water. Soon the Steel Roses would mount their motorcycles and ride away, continuing their interrupted journey, leaving Oak Ridge forever changed by their brief presence. The thought stirred complicated emotions he wasn't yet ready to examine. Gratitude and regret, respect, and something deeper that had begun forming in those quiet moments with Alex. Those shared glances of understanding, those small revelations of compatibility beyond crisis management. He was checking the garage doors, ensuring they would close securely despite water damage, when Alex approached. Her women had finished most of the cleanup, their saddlebags repacked, their preparations for departure nearly complete. Yet something in her expression suggested internal conflict, decision points not yet resolved, possibilities still being evaluated. We'll be moving on within the hour. Highway Patrol says the road north is clear enough for motorcycles even if larger vehicles still can't get through. The information was delivered with her characteristic directness, but Matthew caught the hesitation beneath the unasked question hovering in the space between them. He found himself searching for the right response, for words that would acknowledge what had formed between them without demanding more than she was prepared to give. Before he could respond, Sheriff Miller's patrol car pulled up outside, followed by several other vehicles. The sheriff entered alone, his expression grave but determined, his posture suggesting official business rather than emergency response. Town council's called an emergency meeting at the library, 2 hours from now. They've requested statements from all evacuation center leaders, official record of the disaster response. The neutral phrasing didn't quite conceal the political maneuvering behind the request. Bennett would use the meeting to reassert control, to shape the narrative of the flood and its aftermath, to minimize contributions that threatened his authority while highlighting those that reinforced it. Standard political operations resumed at the earliest possible moment after crisis. Alex nodded, processing this development with military assessment. New tactical situation, adjusted timeline, recalculated options. She glanced at her women already preparing for departure, then back at the sheriff with quiet determination. We'll delay our departure to attend. Historical records should be accurate, especially about civilian contributions during emergency response. The sheriff's expression revealed nothing but a slight relaxation of his shoulder. Shoulders suggested relief, perhaps at having witnesses to counter whatever narrative Bennett might attempt to establish, perhaps at the continued presence of capable allies in what promised to be a contentious political battlefield. After he departed, Alex turned to her women, who had gathered naturally at the shift in atmosphere. The Steel Roses listened to her explanation with varying expressions. Resignation, determination, flashes of anger quickly controlled. They had experienced similar situations before, Matthew realized. Official proceedings where their contributions were minimized, their character questioned, their presence tolerated rather than welcomed once immediate danger had passed. Jessie approached Lily, who had been helping with the final cleanup, her small face serious with the weight of adult concerns beyond her years. The young biker knelt to meet the child at eye level, pulling something from her pocket, a small sketchbook and a set of quality drawing pencils, for the next artist in the Steel Roses. When you're old enough to ride. The gift was simple but meaningful acknowledgement of connection formed of potential, recognized of value seen beyond conventional expectations. Lily accepted it with solemn appreciation, understanding instinctively the significance behind the gesture. She reached into her own pocket, withdrawing the carefully folded drawing she'd been working on throughout the morning. A detailed sketch of the Steel Roses helping evacuees, their faces rendered with surprising accuracy for such young hands. Jessie accepted the offering with equal seriousness, carefully tucking it into her jacket, as if it were a priceless document rather than a child's drawing. The exchange carried weight beyond words, recognition between kindred spirits, separated by age but connected by shared understanding, by seeing the world through similar eyes. As the Steel Roses prepared for the council meeting, Matthew found a moment of unexpected privacy with Alex near the repaired side door. The garage had emptied of evacuees, the constant demands of crisis management had eased, allowing space for conversation beyond immediate necessities. Yet now, given that opportunity, words seemed inadequate to express the complex emotions of the past 36 hours. Alex broke the silence first, her directness both challenge and gift. Bennett will try to control the narrative today, paint us as necessary evils rather than essential allies. It's what men like him do, reshape reality to maintain their version of order. The assessment was accurate but incomplete. Focusing on external battles rather than the unspoken current between them, the connection formed through shared crisis, through recognized compatibility, through moments of understanding that transcended their different lives and circumstances. Matthew chose his response carefully, addressing both the spoken concern and the unspoken question. Some narratives can't be controlled. Truth has its own power, especially when people have seen it with their own eyes. She held his gaze, something shifting in her expression. A slight softening, a momentary glimpse beneath the leader's mask, to the woman beneath, to vulnerabilities and hopes typically kept guarded. Before she could respond, however, Gabe approached with practical updates about transportation arrangements for the council meeting, pulling them both back to immediate responsibilities to the public roles that had temporarily overshadowed private connections. The Oak Ridge Public Library had survived the flood with minimal damage, its position on the town's highest ground proving fortunate. By early afternoon, it had transformed from book repository to command center, its main reading room now hosting relief workers, emergency personnel, and local officials attempting to coordinate recovery efforts. Tables were piled with maps and supply inventories. Volunteers manned phones reconnecting. Separated families, medical staff treated minor injuries in converted study rooms. The Steel Roses entered as a unit, their leather jackets now clean of mud, but still bearing the distinctive emblem that had once triggered fear and suspicion throughout Oak Ridge. They moved with military discipline, Alex at their center, heads high, despite the sideways glances and whispered comments their appearance generated among some of the gathered townspeople. Matthew and Lily accompanied them, a visible alignment that didn't go unnoticed by watching eyes. Sheriff Miller nodded in acknowledgement as they entered, his expression suggesting both welcome and warning. Appreciation for their continued assistance alongside recognition of the political currents still flowing beneath Oak Ridge's surface, despite the flood's physical disruption. Mayor Bennett sat at the main table surrounded by remaining town council members and emergency management officials from Eugene. His suit had been replaced by clean khakis and a polo shirt bearing the town seal, his appearance restored to professional standards despite continuing crisis. His expression upon seeing the Steel Roses enter contained multitudes, irritation at their continued presence, calculation of political ramifications, assessment of potential threats to his carefully constructed narrative. The meeting began with damage reports, statistics that transformed personal tragedies into manageable data points. 47 homes destroyed completely, 132 with major damage, 38 businesses flooded, 3 confirmed deaths, 6 people still unaccounted for, infrastructure impacts, economic projections, recovery timelines, federal assistance applications. The bureaucracy of disaster, reducing catastrophe to categories and subcategories, to forms and procedures, to the illusion of control reimposed upon chaos. Throughout these presentations, Bennett maintained his mayoral persona, appropriately grave, occasionally inserting comments that positioned him as central to response efforts, subtly redirecting credit toward official channels while minimizing spontaneous civilian contributions. A masterful political performance, establishing the narrative he wanted recorded in official minutes and public memory. Then came time for evacuation center reports. Each designated shelter leader provided brief summaries of numbers, housed resources, used challenges encountered. Professional, factual, unremarkable. Until Matthew's turn arrived. He stood feeling the weight of expectant gazes, Bennett's calculating stare, the Steel Roses' quiet support, Sheriff Miller's careful neutrality, Lily's complete confidence in her father. The room had grown more crowded as word spread about the meeting, evacuees filtering in to hear official pronouncements about their town's future, to learn when they might return to damaged homes, when water and electricity might be restored, when life might resume its normal patterns. Matthew spoke simply, without embellishment or accusation, describing the garage's transformation from reluctant shelter to essential evacuation center, the cooperation between townspeople and the Steel Roses, the lives saved through combined effort. He acknowledged each woman by name and contribution, Gabe's medical expertise, Jesse's work with traumatized children, Tanya's engineering solutions to structural challenges, and a dozen others whose skills had proved invaluable during crisis. He concluded by addressing the unspoken question that hung in the room, the judgment that had preceded the storm and threatened to resurface in its aftermath. We talk about community values in Oak Ridge, about small town spirit and helping neighbors in need. Last night showed what those words truly mean. When strangers become neighbors through shared purpose, when differences disappear in the face of common threat, when what matters isn't who you are, but what you do when lives hang in the balance. The simple testimony delivered without political calculation or personal agenda resonated through the crowded room. Murmurs of agreement rose from gathered evacuees who had witnessed firsthand the Steel Rose's efforts, who had been sheltered and fed and comforted by women they might previously have crossed the street to avoid. Bennett attempted to reclaim control to redirect the meeting toward logistical matters and official response channels. But the narrative had shifted momentum, carrying away from his preferred storyline towards something more authentic, more reflective of actual experience rather than political convenience. Alex stood next her military bearing, commanding attention without dramatic gesture or raised voice. The Steel Roses recognize the courage shown by Oak Ridge's residents during this crisis. Ordinary people who became extraordinary when needed, who didn't wait for official permission to help neighbors, to share resources, to comfort strangers. That's the true measure of any community. Not how it treats those who obviously belong, but how it responds to those who don't. The simple observation carried force beyond its words, an acknowledgement of human connection that transcended social categories of possibilities beyond us versus them, thinking of community defined by shared humanity rather than external markers of belonging. The room fell silent, absorbing implications that extended beyond the immediate crisis to questions of how Oak Ridge might rebuild, what values might guide recovery, what lessons might be carried forward. Margaret Wilson broke the silence, rising from her seat among evacuees with the dignified determination of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize important moments when they arrived. What these women did wasn't just about emergency response. It was about seeing beyond labels to the people underneath. Something we'd all do well to remember when this crisis is past and we're deciding what kind of town we want to rebuild. Her endorsement carried particular weight given her status in Oak Ridge, respected elder, former librarian keeper of the town's institutional memory through decades of change. Bennett's expression revealed his recognition of shifting political ground of narrative control, slipping away despite his careful stage management of public opinion, moving in directions he hadn't anticipated and couldn't easily redirect. The meeting continued with additional testimonies, evacuees describing Steel Roses carrying elderly residents through floodwaters, comforting frightened children, sharing limited resources without reservation. Each account built upon previous ones, creating a composite portrait at odds with the dangerous outsiders, characterization that had dominated before the storm. By meeting's end, the political calculus had shifted visibly. Bennett, increasingly isolated in his continued wariness, community sentiment, evolving toward genuine appreciation and respect. As the gathering dispersed, people approached the Steel Roses individually, offering thanks, sharing contact information, extending invitations to return under happier circumstances. The transformation wasn't universal. Some residents maintained distance, suspicious expressions suggesting unchangeable minds. But the balance had tipped decisively, the majority recognizing allies where they had previously seen only threats. Outside the library, Oak Ridge continued its slow recovery. Emergency vehicles navigated debris-strewn streets. Residents in mud-caked boots assessed damage to homes and businesses. Volunteers distributed bottled water and packaged meals. The physical devastation remained overwhelming, the road to normalcy long and uncertain. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Connections formed perspectives, altered possibilities, revealed that might guide reconstruction towards something stronger than what had existed before. The Steel Roses prepared to depart, their motorcycles lined up on the library's undamaged parking lot, saddlebags secured for the journey north. They moved with the efficiency of women accustomed to transitions, to arriving and departing, to brief but intense connections formed, and then necessarily released as the road called them onward. Matthew stood with Lily beside his truck, watching the preparations with complicated emotions. The past 36 hours had altered something fundamental in his understanding of community, of purpose, of possibilities, beyond the careful isolation he'd maintained since Sarah's death. The prospect of returning to that existence, to the quiet routine of garage and home, without the energy and connection the Steel Roses had briefly introduced, created an unexpected hollowness in his chest. Alex approached as her women completed final preparations. Her leather jacket was zipped against the cooling afternoon air, her short hair slightly tousled by breeze, her expression holding something beyond the leader's mask she typically presented to the world. Oak Ridge was lucky, not just with the flood, but with its people. Most towns have more Bennetts than Margarets. The observation carried no bitterness, only experienced assessment, the voice of someone who had seen many communities, who recognized patterns in human response to difference, who maintained realistic expectations while still allowing for pleasant surprises. Matthew searched for adequate response, for words that would acknowledge what had formed between them without demanding commitments impossible to fulfill, given their different paths. Lily solved the dilemma in her direct child's way. You should come back, when there's no flood, when people can meet you properly. Alex smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her composed exterior. Her gaze included both father and daughter, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. I'd like that. Roads go both ways after all. The simple statement opened possibilities without pressure, acknowledged connection without demand, recognized potential futures without forcing immediate decisions. Matthew felt something tighten his chest, ease slightly. Not resolution, but recognition. Not closure, but continuation. Not ending, but pause. Sheriff Miller approached his expression, suggesting official business rather than personal farewell. The meeting's political aftermath had begun. Decisions about resource allocation, recovery priorities, rebuilding standards. Battles that would determine Oak Ridge's future character as much as any flood damage or physical reconstruction. Bennett's pushing for immediate restoration of the business district, talking about opportunity to upgrade while rebuilding. His developer friends are already circling. Thought you should know. The information wasn't surprising but carried significant implications. For Matthew's garage, located on increasingly valuable real estate, for the town's economic balance between local businesses and chain outlets, for the character of post-flood Oak Ridge, and who would have voice in its reconstruction. Political waters still flowed beneath the physical recovery currents, potentially as destructive as any floodwaters. Alex assessed this new tactical situation with military precision. Towns often become what they feared they were losing, especially after disaster. Makes people grab for the familiar, even if it wasn't working before. The insight resonated beyond Oak Ridge's specific circumstances to broader patterns of human response to disruption. The tendency to recreate flawed systems, rather than use destruction as opportunity for meaningful change, to rebuild walls identical to those that failed to restore, rather than reimagine. Matthew considered the garage that had been both his livelihood and shelter for crisis victims, the community that had simultaneously rejected strangers and been saved by them, the possibilities revealed when necessity stripped away preconceptions and revealed essential humanity beneath social categories. What's familiar isn't always what's needed. Sometimes you have to open doors you thought would stay closed. The observation encompassed both Oak Ridge's future and his own community reconstruction, and personal rebuilding, political possibilities, and private potential. Alex met his gaze with quiet understanding, recognition of multiple meanings contained in simple words. The connection between them deepened in that moment, beyond crisis management, beyond shared military background, beyond brief alliance against natural disaster, towards something more personal, more enduring, more rich with possibility. Lily observed this exchange with a child's perceptiveness, catching currents of meaning that flowed beneath adult conversation. She touched the sketchbook Jesse had given her, then looked up at Alex with sudden inspiration. You could stay, help rebuild. Steel roses know how to fix things. The directness of a child cutting through complications to essential questions. Alex knelt to Lily's level, addressing her with the seriousness she deserved rather than the patronizing dismissal adults often offered children who spoke uncomfortable truths. Some of us might come back to help, but right now there are other people counting on us, other places we need to be. Roads we promise to travel. The steel roses keep their promises. The explanation acknowledged reality without crushing hope, maintained integrity while leaving doors ajar, respected commitments while recognizing new possibilities. Lily absorbed this with thoughtful consideration, accepting adult complexity without surrendering childish directness. You promised to come back. Alex glanced up at Matthew, seeking permission before making commitments that would affect his daughter's expectations and emotions. His slight nod, granted that permission, acknowledged shared responsibility for whatever answer she might give. I promised to treat him and to stay in touch while we're apart. The careful promise, honest about limitations while affirming genuine intention, satisfied Lily, who nodded with solemn acceptance before offering a quick, fierce hug that clearly caught Alex by surprise. The Steel Roses leader returned the embrace after a momentary hesitation, something unexpectedly vulnerable crossing her expression. Perhaps memory of other children, other connections, other moments when the road's demands had pulled against human bonds. The farewell continued with practical exchanges, contact information, suggestions for reliable contractors who wouldn't price gouge during rebuilding, offers of future assistance when the Steel Roses' journey brought them back through Oregon. Beneath these logistical matters flowed deeper currents. Connections formed that transcended circumstance, possibilities recognized that might survive separation, foundations laid that could support future building. As the Steel Roses mounted their motorcycles, the gathered crowd of Oak Ridge residents spontaneously formed a farewell line along the library's driveway. People who had once locked doors at the mere mention of motorcycle gangs now stood waving, calling out personal thanks, offering good wishes for safe travels. Not universal acceptance, some residents remained conspicuously absent, Bennett among them, but a significant shift from the reception that had greeted their arrival less than 2 days earlier. Alex led her women in formation down the line, each rider acknowledging the farewell with dignified nods or raised hands, maintaining the proud bearing that defined the Steel Roses, even while accepting this unexpected appreciation. At line's end, she stopped briefly beside Matthew and Lily's truck, removing her glove to offer a bare hand in farewell. Skin against skin, person to person, beyond roles and representations. Matthew accepted the offered hand, feeling unexpected warmth spread from that simple contact. Thank you for opening your door when everyone said to keep it closed. Not many would have made that choice. The gratitude acknowledged more than shelter from storm. Recognition of seeing beyond labels, of choosing compassion over caution, of recognizing humanity beneath social categories. Matthew held her gaze, allowing himself to fully inhabit the moment rather than retreating behind the careful distance he'd maintained since Sarah's death. Doors are meant to open. Otherwise, they're just walls with hinges. Alex smiled, genuine, unguarded, a glimpse of the woman beneath the leader's necessary armor. Then she released his hand, redonned her glove, and rejoined her waiting women. With synchronized precision, the Steel Roses started their engines, the combined rumble echoing across Oak Ridge's damaged landscape like thunder from a different kind of storm, one that cleared air rather than flooding ground, that revealed new horizons rather than washing away existing structures. They departed in formation, leather jackets and chrome glinting in afternoon sunlight, heading north toward whatever commitments called them onward. Matthew and Lily watched until they disappeared around a bend in the debris-cleared highway, the sound of their engines gradually fading into distance. The garage awaited inspection repairs, returned to function as business rather than emergency shelter. Oak Ridge faced months of rebuilding, political battles over recovery, priorities, questions about what would be restored and what might be reimagined. Life would resume its patterns, altered by flood experience, but eventually settling into new routines. New normals, new understandings of community and purpose and possibility. But something had fundamentally changed in those 36 hours of crisis. Perspectives shifted, connections formed, doors opened that might remain ajar despite distance and circumstance. As Matthew turned toward his mud-covered truck, Lily clutched her new sketchbook with one hand and slipped the other into her father's grasp. Her expression contained both childhood, resilience, and unexpected wisdom. As she looked up at the road ahead, "They'll be back, Dad. Some storms are meant to change things forever."